good evening from Texas, University of Texas at Austin. I'm Logan Dubel, and it's election night here in the Lone Star State and across the nation. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, over the next 2 hours, we are your election headquarters. We'll bring you live coverage and analysis of all the key races that matter here in Austin, Texas, and nationally, as the balance of power in the United States Congress is at stake. Every 15 minutes or as news breaks, we'll be here at our election desk bringing you the latest numbers and key race alerts as ballots are counted. Throughout the night, we'll have live analysis and context from analysts and pundits from across the political spectrum, helping you understand what the results could mean. And our panel will tackle topics from abortion, immigration, education, and more. But first, here are the races that we're keeping our eyes on. We're, of course, watching the contest for governor, and we have a big call to make on that momentarily, as incumbent Governor Greg Abbott is facing off against challenger Beto O'Rourke. We're also watching the elections for Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Comptroller, Land Commissioner, and Agricultural Commissioner. We're also watching races in our courts, and locally we're keeping an eye on City Council, School Board, and State Senate elections, and of course, the Mayor of Austin. So let's make that big call that we just teased up moments ago. We do have several news outlets at this point projecting that Governor Abbott has defeated Beto O'Rourke, his Democratic challenger, to remain in office, reaching a third term. Latest estimates with about 41% of the votes in have Governor Abbott up by almost 7 points. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that race. We're also watching, of course, the balance of power in the House and the Senate. So far, Republicans have had their first pickup. They need 5 pickups in order to flip the House and 1 Senate seat. Lots of hot contests in the Senate, of course, in Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and other places we're keeping an eye on. But of course, that big news that Governor Abbott is going to have a third term, it looks like, here in the state of Texas. So we'll continue to keep an eye on those races in the state and beyond. But it's important to remember that we will likely be getting results throughout the evening and beyond, and we'll have to wait for all of those votes to be counted before we go ahead and make all of those paramount calls. So we'll be back with more updates throughout the night. But now, for the first time tonight, we're going to toss it over to our moderator and our panel for some analysis on how we got here to election night, and they're going to get right into it. So let's send it over to our moderator and our panel. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Logan. Now let's get started over and literally talk and introduce everybody at this panel. Starting from the left side of your screen over here, we have Julia Mia, known for her cultural commentary for race and gender on TikTok. Miss Mia is the legislative aide for Senator Eckhart. Great to have you on, Julia, and how are you doing tonight?
You know, it's always a great night to celebrate American democracy, so I'm doing great. What about you, Kevin?
It's going to be a fun night, I'll tell you. I'll tell you that for the very least. Right next to Julia, we have Ariba Barmel. Miss Barmel is one of our TSTV analysts specializing in the Democratic side of politics. How are you doing today, Ariba?
I'm doing great. Always great to be here. I'm excited to see what happens tonight.
Now, on the right side, most side of your screen, we have Grant Rommel. And Mr. Rommel is a former chair of UT College Republicans and is a former staffer of the Texas State House. Grant, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Looks like we're going to have a pretty good night over here on this side, so looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah, we're going to have a fun night tonight, of course. And right next to him, we also have Mr. Joseph Sweeney. Mr. Sweeney is one of our TSTV analysts as well, specializing on the Republican side of politics. How are you doing today, Joseph?
Doing pretty good today, Kevin. Looking forward to a nice civil discussion.
Nick, that is great to have you guys along. It's going to be a fun show all throughout. Now let's just get straight into it. For months, Beto O'Rourke and Greg Abbott have been campaigning fiercely, leading to this very moment tonight. My opening question to you all tonight is that how have both candidates sought out to reaching to young voters, especially to the college demographic? Ariba, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, for sure. So looking at the Democratic side of things at Beto did go on a college tour specifically to talk to younger age and college age voters. He stopped at UT Austin on day 1 of that college tour. At LBJ, he held a rally, spoke to some voters, and got them registered to vote as well. He came back during early voting to the FAC to again talk to students. And of course, I think we all remember the iconic moment when he was at the Harry Styles concert. So Beto has definitely been making special effort to reach out to college students.
Definitely cannot forget about that moment when he hopped on the stage for Harry Styles and all that. But Joseph, what do you think is going on in terms of the Republican side of things in terms of that question?
So, well, as far as Abbott's campaign goes, whereas Beto took a newer approach with aiming towards younger voters, Abbott stuck more to his base, campaigning in areas like Victoria and Wichita Falls, which are both deeply conservative congressional districts if you look at the numbers. The most that he's done to reach sort of across the aisle has been in places like El Paso, which of course is Beto O'Rourke's hometown. He did campaign there a little. But as far as that, he has not done nearly as much to reach out to younger voters.
And Grant, I'm going to extend the question to you as well. In terms of what you've seen in terms of how Abbott has campaigned, what do you think he's done successfully so far in reaching out to younger voters?
Yeah, I think he's stuck to his guns, of course, when it comes to the main base. But obviously, he's been reaching out to collegiate organizations, obviously trying to get their support, and obviously, students are willing to support him. But also, I think he understands the reality on the ground, which is college campuses are not the most welcoming environment for conservative and Republican students. And I think he just kind of understands, look, the reality on the ground is if we go out there, we're not going to be, getting the most enthusiasm possible. So I think, like you said, he's been sticking to his guns. He's sticking to the voters who have supported him in previous years, going out to Victoria, going out to rural Texas, going out to suburban Texas. So he's been doing that, and I think it's going to definitely pay off tonight.
As you mentioned, you said that he's been avoiding college campuses a little bit. I'm going to switch over to Julia over here. How do you think Beto has done well in his campaigning? I mean, Ariba mentioned a little bit in terms of the Harry Styles concert. Just tell me a little bit about that.
For sure, it's definitely very exciting to see a politician really focus on this young voter base, especially in Texas. The polls as of yesterday show how young voters were only about 9% of the voting unit when it came to early voting. So it's really interesting to see that he focused his mindset there. Some stats will show that most college students, or a lot of college students, lean more towards Beto. So I think that was really interesting to see him really play into that. And you see him doing these very big rallies and really grand events that you would usually see the type of energy for that from something such as a presidential race or an even bigger race than governor. So I thought it was really interesting to also see that side of him.
Leading up to tonight's show, we saw huge lines all over UT campus wherever the voting was available. But on to my next question, I'm going to start with Joseph on this. How do you think young voters' apathy towards this election will affect the governor's race? What you got for me?
All right, so looking strictly at the numbers, Kevin, we can see that early voter turnout has been lower than it was in previous years. Looking at 2018 midterms specifically, about 40% of their voting was done early, whereas now we're projecting only about 31% in for early voting. And otherwise, as for people our age, people aged 18 to 24 in Texas specifically, only have a voter turnout of about 24%. So that'll definitely have a turnout in this election, Kevin.
And what else do you think, Ariba, in terms of adding on to what Joseph just said?
Yeah, so it seems like we've pretty much already called the governor race. So taking that into account, it could potentially be because of this younger voter apathy that Beto was not able to pick up the numbers he was hoping to pick up tonight. We did see an increase in registration due to issues like abortion that brought younger people out to register to vote, but that did not seem to translate into the polls tonight.
Okay, talking about how things translate into polls, I also want to bring up what are the most important issues for Republicans and Democratic student voters. I'm going to start off with Julia on this question. What do you think were the reasons why student voters came out to vote at the polls tonight?
So we saw a huge pickup in registering to vote after the reversal of Roe v. Wade. I think a lot of young women especially are worried about that because of the snowballing effect that can have. Not only does Roe v. Wade codify a lot of things when it regards to abortion, but it also really looks into things such as protecting different privacy acts for women and different Americans. I think a lot of girls or women showed up for that, but then you also see a huge issue for students is student loan forgiveness with federal mandates such as the Pell Grant and things like that for student loan forgiveness. That was definitely on the top of people's minds, I think, for students and around campus.
All of these topics are stuff we're going to talk about throughout this 2-hour election special, so don't go anywhere if you're really looking. We're really going to be talking about a lot of fun stuff. But Grant, I'm going to have you answer that question on the Republican side of things. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think college students, when it comes to Republican college students, I think they're concerned about very much the same things that the average Republican voter is looking at. They're looking at, am I going to be able to get a job when I graduate? Am I going to be able to afford rent? Am I going to be crushed by inflation? Am I going to be crushed by a bad economy? And I think they're looking at that and they're saying, we need to put people in power that are not going to enact these policies that have caused this over the past couple of years. And so I think they're going to be a bit more motivated than their Democrat colleagues in college, which I think is why we're seeing a reduction in early voting turnout and young voter turnout in this election. So I think it's going to be Republican enthusiasm throughout, which is probably why Governor Abbott's going to hold steady and win this election.
And I'm going to pass this question on along to my TSTV analyst. Like, one of you guys can just jump in and see if there's anything else you would like to add on to what are the most important issues for Republicans and Democrats for this year.
Yeah, I think they've hit the big ones for sure. Definitely the cost of college and abortion are top on people's minds recently. Beto is pro-choice. He wants to repeal the abortion ban, wants to invest in contraception, cancer screenings, family planning services. So abortion is definitely a big issue for Democrats.
And Joseph?
Yes, so the economy was definitely a big issue for Republican voters. Just a quick statistic for you. Biden's approval ratings have dropped to about 40%, and that is contributed in part to the state of the economy, what with inflation and rising costs of living.
Economy and the abortion is something we're going to be talking about right after the break, so don't go anywhere, folks. We will be right back on this special night.
8% right now, so we're continuing to keep an eye on that very hotly contested race. It's also very tight in the race for lieutenant governor. Incumbent Dan Patrick is over the Democratic challenger there by about 4 points as of right now, and we're also watching other races with railroad commissioner and land commissioner. Currently, Republicans up in those seats by about 6 to 7 points, so we're continuing to watch those as they all remain extremely close races. And again, the Senate is where we're also keeping our eyes. Race is very close still there. Georgia right now, incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock on the Democratic side is up over Herschel Walker by about 2 points with about 66% of the vote in there. And J.D. Vance, the Republican in Ohio, has taken over the lead currently held by Congressman Tim Ryan. He's up 52% to 48%. And then votes are slowly trickling in Pennsylvania, where we're watching the contest between John Fetterman, the current lieutenant governor there. He's up 56% to Dr. Oz's 42%, but again, only about a quarter of the vote in there. We're also watching, of course, Florida, where big calls were made very early in the night with current Senator Marco Rubio and Governor Ron DeSantis winning big over their Democratic challengers. But will that translate into a red wave for the rest of the night? And what does that all mean, especially here in Texas? Let's send it back over to our panel. We'll be back just in a few moments.
Logan for bringing it back up to us, and we are going to be talking about the economy for this particular segment. Isn't that just a fun topic to talk about? I'm going to start off asking you guys, and Joseph and Ariba, I'm going to open up to you guys. How has the state of economy really impacted students' views in terms of who they're going to vote for this election? Let's start for Joseph.
Yeah, so if we look at just the big picture, Kevin, we can see that inflation has risen by about 8% in the past year. And additionally, 44% of Americans said that the economy and inflation were the main reasons that they went to the polls. As for Governor Greg Abbott's policy, so far Texas has not announced plans for inflation reimbursement checks, but we do still have a $27 million surplus in tax revenue to spend going into 2023. Comptroller Glenn Hager said that this could justify decreasing property taxes in order to increase pay for state employees.
What about you, Ariba? What do you have in terms of this?
Yeah, looking at some more student-specific issues, we know that campus housing costs have been at the top of everyone's mind as we're signing leases for next year, and living costs as well are a big issue for students. Looking specifically at Beto's policy points, he wants to create jobs by expanding the energy and healthcare industries. He wants to use infrastructure development projects to also increase jobs, and not only increase these jobs, but increase the minimum wage and ensure Texans can live off of them and have access to paid and sick leave as well.
Okay, I'm going to toss it over to Grant over here. Grant, tell me, what has Abbott done in your perspective to appeal in terms of his economical?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear. Governor Abbott was one of the governors who helped his state recover pretty quickly and very, very well through the end of the pandemic. I think he minimized the damage pretty well in the state of Texas. But what I also think he's done is he's brought in jobs from all over the country. I know he's brought jobs in from California with Elon Musk bringing, one or two companies over here. He's got jobs from Google. He's got expanded manufacturing. Texas is a booming economy right now. I think it's one of the top 15 economies in the world right now. So just keeping that in mind, I mean, Governor Abbott's definitely done something here that is quite remarkable. So I think, voters are looking at that and they're saying, we want more of this in our state.
definitely is quite clear that that has been one of the biggest campaigning items and one of the biggest reasons people vote for Abbott himself. But for what has Beto done, Julia, what do you think he has done in terms of the economy?
Yeah, so Beto is really going to focus on small businesses and small business plans, along with doing things such as raising the minimum wage. He states over and over again in his campaigns how Texas has dropped from 7th to 18th place for small business survival rate. He thinks that this will be a way to really revive the economy. As Ariba has already stated, he's really looking into expanding the energy sector and especially green energy sector. I think this is really plausible with the Texas going about to go into session, really looking at carbon capture programs, which will be a program that really reaches across the aisle, and it's a way to get federal funding for Texas. So I think those are really great plans that Beto has really promised to people.
Now, we can go and talk about the economy forever, but we got another topic to talk about, and it's another hot button topic that I'm pretty sure you guys are all aware of, abortion. So in terms of abortion being a hot topic issue for students in terms of this election, how has that affected turnout? Ariba, let's start with you.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, abortion was an issue that brought younger people out to register to vote, but it doesn't seem like that is translating into the polls, with younger voter turnout still being pretty low. Looking at some survey data, we can see that Texans don't support the current abortion ban, with about 60% of voters saying that they support abortions in all or most cases.
Now, it's also a big, like Beto has campaigned quite a bit on the topic of abortion, but what has Abbott done in terms of abortion?
Well, just giving you sort of the broad overview, Kevin, women have made up about 55% of new registered voters since the Dobbs decision was made in June, which of course overturned Roe v. Wade. And other than that, I mean, we can see that for voters our age, from about age 18 to 30, before that decision, only about 38% of them described themselves as highly motivated to vote. After that decision was made, that number jumped to about 47%. So that is definitely, abortion is definitely an issue that's driving this election, Kevin.
Definitely, for sure. Grant, would you like to add anything on that?
Yeah, look, so I don't think it's an issue that's going to be driving this election. I think there was a lot of momentum that that Democrats could have brought in from this summer with the Jackson v. Dobbs decision. But I think that was stomped out when people started looking at their pocketbooks and saying, hey, the spike in increase in prices in eggs at the supermarket's ridiculous. The price in gas this summer was terrible. I think they were looking at things that were more immediate to them, and considering that voters this summer, or not this summer, I'm sorry, earlier this year, they were saying their top issue was the economy. When I think it was somewhere around 16% were saying that abortion was their #1 issue. So, the big issue was the economy. And I think, yes, obviously younger voters were more motivated by something that was something more immediate and more pressing to them at the time. But like I said, I don't think it's panned out because the momentum died out over the summer and into the school year.
And Julia, I feel like you would say something different to that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up pocketbooks, because talking about women's health and access to prenatal care, child care, and women's health care has been something that, yes, does affect your pocketbooks, and that a lot of women really care about. We have to look at the statistics of it. Texas has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the nation, along with some of the worst prenatal access care. We have to look at these issues, and that is what is tied in with Roe v. Wade. When we look at people really caring about these issues, really caring about those things such as their pocketbooks and such, they're also thinking about things that would affect their health and how they can get access to things that are cheaper, such as health care. We can't really look at the reversal of Roe v. Wade and say it hasn't really affected our voting base when it motivated so many women to register to vote and go out to vote. I think this has really, really affected this election, and it's also really interesting to see how many Texans disagree with the fact of the full abortion ban.
I'm going to bring this question to both Grant and Julia. Do you feel like the economy or abortion has factored into this election more? What weighs more? From
after you.
Okay. Well, I feel like you can't really talk about abortion unless you also talk about the economy and abortion really do go together. When you talk about family planning, when you talk about access to health care, when you talk about prenatal care, those are all affected by the economy, but also affected by bodily autonomy.
And you, Grant?
I don't see the two as connected at all. I think, yes, you can talk about health care plans and you can talk about women's reproductive rights and anything you want on that matter, but we're talking more about dinner table issues that Americans are struggling with more than they're worried about, whether or not they can go get an abortion. So people are more worried about their gas prices.
Well, it's not just about abortion.
Right. Exactly. So the key factor is
You
the
don't
economy.
think
It's
people
not
are
about
sitting
abortion.
at the dinner table worried about whether they can afford a child to feed at the dinner table?
No, they're not worried about that right now. They're more worried about whether or not their gas prices are going to be, or whether or not their gas prices can get them to work.
And then why are they worried about their gas prices? Why are they worried about
Because the
getting to work?
president
You
has
have to also
caused a
think about
major
how Texas is
inflationary
really
problem.
running on the fact that they are supporting these family values and these nuclear family units. And you can't talk about these family values or nuclear family units without talking about planning your own reproductive rights and reproductive health care.
And we can go on forever talking about this, but we definitely got so many more topics to go out throughout this entire election special. So after the break, we're going to be talking about Uvalde and gun control. Very fun topics. We'll be right back.
I'm Mal Lambert here at TSTV News Headquarters, and you're watching Texas News Primetime.
And we are continuing to keep a close eye on all of these big races here in Texas and beyond. Latest updates on the governor's numbers. We are looking at incumbent Greg Abbott. Again, as we mentioned, some outlets calling the race for the current governor. He is up, according to the latest numbers, with 44% of the votes in by about 9 points. So we're continuing to keep an eye on that. But some other races that are hotly contested across Texas right now. Let's take a look at some of those. Currently, Dan Patrick, the current lieutenant governor, is also leading his Democratic challenger by about 9 points. Same thing is happening there. The Republican leading by a little bit more in terms of the comptroller's role, but the Attorney General's race is where all eyes seem to be right now. Latest estimates, depending on where you look, put the race neck and neck, and others have current Attorney General up, Ken Paxton up by about 8 points. So we're continuing to keep a close eye on all of those races. Those are very, very important, all playing out. And we're just getting another update on the governor's race with current Governor Greg Abbott extending his lead. So we're continuing to keep an eye on that. If we take a look and zoom out across the rest of the country right now, Georgia, very tight. Herschel Walker, the Republican there, has taken the lead based off the latest estimates with 69% of the vote in. Herschel Walker is leading by just about 1 point and 30,000 votes. So very close race that's going to come down to the wire there in Georgia. Ohio, we're also keeping an eye on that. 60% of the vote in. J.D. Vance, the Republican there, has taken a lead by about 6 points. It was a little closer earlier in the evening, but again, we've still got a solid chunk of that vote we're waiting on. It's also getting tighter in Pennsylvania, but current Lieutenant Governor, the Democrat John Fetterman, has kept his lead. He's up by about 8 points right now over Dr. Oz, and we've still only got about a third of that vote in. So we're keeping a close eye on all of these. One highlight just want to point out before we pass it off to our panel is that Florida elected its first Gen Z congressman. Big thing for college students to keep an eye on there. 25-year-old Maxwell Frost on the Democratic side. We're going to throw it over to our panel now. Kevin.
Thank you again, Logan. And one of the biggest topics of this entire year has been the tragic event that happened in Uvalde. We really have to speak into existence of how, not speak into existence, but we have to really talk about how much of an impact Uvalde had in terms of campaigning issues. And I'm going to start with Ariba over here. Tell me, how big of a factor was Uvalde for Beto's campaign?
Yeah, we definitely saw Beto capitalizing on this tragedy along the campaign trail. He was really using it as a talking point, especially continually referencing Abbott saying that it could have been worse following the tragedy. Looking at his specific policy points, he wants to repeal permitless carry, close background check loopholes, and implement effective red flag law systems. He has also discussed how weapons like AK-47s and AR-15s really don't belong in the hands of civilians. If we look at some more gun control statistics more broadly, we see that California, which is ranked first for gun safety and has some of the laws that Beto was campaigning on and for, has the 44th lowest gun death rate in the nation, with significantly lower death rates than the national average. So looking at statistics like this, we can see that gun safety laws do work, and Uvalde families have been supporting Beto due to Abbott's lack of action.
Now, Joseph, I'm pretty sure Abbott has been doing quite the opposite in terms of what his strategy is towards gun control and whatever. So tell me, what has Abbott done in terms of, ever since this event happened, towards the idea of gun control?
So Abbott's definitely remained consistent with his views. He has remained pro-Second Amendment. He has passed laws, including things like open carry, campus carry, and allowing handguns for people over the age of 21 without a license. And more importantly, he has so far not called an emergency legislative session to amend gun policy following the Uvalde tragedy.
Grant, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, so just before we get into anything other than, obviously, this was a very real and very horrific tragedy, but I think it's important to address that Governor Abbott did not call a special session over this because there is a committee currently being done in the Texas House of Representatives. It's a special committee that is going to investigate the tragedy that happened in Uvalde, and from what I believe should and probably will happen, it will be a committee that will go through its investigation and tailor policy to address the issues that happened at this tragedy.
Thank you, Grant. And Julia, over here, I mean, it's been clear throughout this entire campaign, for Beto's campaign that is specifically, like, he has talked about gun control quite frequently, many, many times. Could you tell me a little bit about, like, how important gun policy has been in towards of his views in terms of trying to influence people to vote for him?
For sure, you can see in even Beto's campaign ads where he gets victims from the Uvalde tragedy to talk, or the parents of children who have passed away to speak for it, really pulling at the heartstring of a lot of people watching these ads and really following this campaign. Something that's really close to him, he talks about the El Paso shooting in the Walmart, and that is something that he's really strict on. He really wants to get rid of AR-15s and AK-47s being owned by civilians.
We can go on forever talking about gun control itself, but that's not the only issue that happened in Uvalde. We also have to talk about education. How much of a factor was education involved in terms of the Uvalde? I'm going to start with Ariba on this one.
Yeah, we definitely see education being an issue that is very close to home for many voters, and Beto is saying that Abbott is underfunding schools and he will fund them fully. So looking at the Democratic side, that is Beto's standpoint on that.
And what about on the Republican side?
Yeah, so Abbott's definitely taken a much different approach towards school safety and things like that. So far, he has appointed the first chief of school safety, and he has also advised TEA, the Texas Education Administration, to create new safety guidelines for public schools. This includes things like reinforcing windows, monitoring and locking doors when they're not monitored, and also installing panic alarms in public schools.
And Grant, do you feel like these are the right measures that Abbott's doing towards making sure, like, Texas is safer?
Yeah, of course. And you know, I think that, you know, there's more to it than just that. I think obviously, you know, there are certain schools in Texas. I know my own high school, when I was growing up, it was a very open campus. You could basically just walk onto it. And I know a lot of schools are making shifts, including my alma mater is making shifts to bring gates or bring fences in to prevent people from being able to just casually walk onto campus. I think that some schools in Texas are especially going to be upping their school security and school police. And obviously those are things that are going to you know, prevent and deter people from committing these atrocities in our state.
What about you, Julia? What do you have to say on that in terms of education?
So education has been a really hot topic for Beto. He mainly goes on saying, and on a lot of his platforms, how teachers in Texas are paid a lot less than a lot of other teachers in our nation. He says that they're underpaid by about $7,500 compared to those in other states. He really wants to look into the benefits for teachers. A really another hot topic is him appealing to the teacher voting base, who usually do lean blue. Another huge thing is looking at teacher retirement and looking at the WEP and how that will affect teacher retirement, and a lot of people saying it's unfair.
Thank you, Julia. We're going to have a lot more information regarding education coming up in the next segment, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
I'm Julia Mia at TSTV headquarters, and you're watching Texas News Primetime.
Hello and welcome back to our continuing election coverage here on TSTV as we continue to watch the governor's race in Texas and all other races around the country. So we are continuing to watch, of course, Governor Abbott leading Beto now by over 10 points. He's currently up with 54.5% of the vote with 45% of the vote in. He's up over Beto's 44.2%, up by about almost 500,000 votes right now. So we're continuing to keep an eye on that. Again, some major news outlets have already called that race. And as we told you in our last segment, we also have a governor's race being called by some media outlets in Georgia, where current Governor Brian Kemp was facing a strong challenge from Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams. So we're continuing to watch that. Senate races, though, as we continue to watch that balance of power in Washington getting tighter and tighter. Georgia, we have 71% of the vote in right now, and Herschel Walker still leading by just about 30,000 votes over current Senator Raphael Warnock. We're watching that. Ohio continuing to stay pretty competitive. J.D. Vance, the Republican there, over Tim Ryan by about 6 points, 53 to 47. And Pennsylvania, votes still trickling in slowly but surely. John Fetterman, the Democrat, there, up by about 5 points, so it's getting tighter with 37% of the vote in. Pennsylvania probably going to be a long wait as we continue to watch that. We're still waiting on some of the results in those Senate races and governor's races out in the West to come in as we have polls closing out there in the coming hours. So we're continuing to watch there. And of course, Wisconsin, another hotly contested Senate seat. Ron Johnson, the Republican incumbent there, is down by about 4 points there with 37% of the vote in. He's currently down by about 40,000 votes. So we're continuing to watch that. Also, the New York governor's race, very competitive there. And of course, races in Texas here, continuing to keep an eye on those as the Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor's race. We still haven't called yet, but they're remaining competitive with the Republicans ahead slightly. We're going to send it now over back to our panel to kick it off with all things education.
Thank you again, Logan. And we talked about this before the commercial break, a little bit about education, and we're going to continue talking about it right now. So the next question I'm going to pose to you guys is how do you think the topic of public funding has affected midterms on a statewide level? Let's open it to Ariba.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we did touch on this a bit earlier, but Beto is saying that Abbott is not fully funding schools, and he wants to change that. He wants to make sure we're fully funding our public schools to provide our kids with the best education possible. He also, while on the campaign trail for president in 2020, discussed a student loan forgiveness plan for public school teachers. And he wants to raise teacher pay and end the STAR test to allow teachers to focus on actually teaching students instead of having to teach to a test.
What about you, Joseph?
Yeah, so if we look on the Abbott side, historically he has championed early education, things like public pre-Ks, having funded about over $130 million for pre-Ks in Texas, I believe back in 2014, Kevin. And then, other than that, I mean, many Republicans in Texas and elsewhere said that this primary, that they support school choice, which is the idea that students should not go to public schools based on their zip code, but should instead go to a public school based on what they and their parents think is the best educationally for them. And that this idea, though, has been considered controversial as you might know, schools are given funding based on their attendance, based on how many students they have. So the idea is that the idea of school choice may take funding away from some other public schools, Kevin.
And I know you talked about this earlier, Grant, a little bit about teacher funding or public school funding as well, but is there anything you would like to add on to Joe?
Yeah, so I think, definitely school choice is going to be one of those key issues in the upcoming legislative session. I know there are more than likely going to be a number of Republican members in the House and in the Senate that are going to be wanting to jump on this issue. It passed with flying colors in Arizona, and I believe soon-to-be former Governor Ducey there, he passed this, and he's calling it one of his landmark achievements over there. So I think there are going to be several legislators that are going to want to model that piece of legislation and bring it here to the state of Texas.
And in terms of the Democratic side of things, in terms of public funding, what do you have to say, Julia?
For sure. So Beto was mainly looking at wanting to increase teacher pay. That was one of the main things in his platform. So doing that, you have to also think about how public funding will affect teacher pay for different school districts, different counties, and that is just mainly one of the main things he's focused on because he really believes in recruiting the best and brightest of educators and believes the only way we could do that is by increasing teacher pay.
Yeah, for sure. Teacher pay is one of the main topics about in like terms of campaigning for this entire election season and whatnot. But on to the next question. In terms of diversity training and racial equity policies, Ariba, what do you have to say in terms of how that's impacted this year's election?
Yeah, we've definitely seen discourse about critical race theory rising a lot, which is the meaning assigned to race being a social construct or conception, and how this affects other things including laws and media, and how racism is systemic in American institutions. And generally, this is used to eliminate race-based hierarchy, so to clear up some misconceptions about CRT. It does not blame anyone for anything based on race. We've seen a lot of discourse about this in K through 12 schools, but it's not taught in K through 12 schools. It is a college-level topic that has really just taken the national stage and blown up a bit.
Joseph, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, so I mean, Abbott has remained consistent saying that critical race theory will not be taught in public schools. Just last year, he signed a law which outlined certain historical documents and then also some other resources that outlined how teachers in public schools can teach subjects such as race, slavery, and racism in the United States.
And Grant, adding on to Joseph.
Yeah, so I think, you know, obviously our friends on the left side of the aisle will say that this is not or was not taught in public schools. But a watered-down version of it was. So critical race theory's origins stem from Gene Stefanczyk and Richard Delgado, if I'm not mistaken. And essentially what it boils down to is that, yes, the systems in America are inherently racist. The point of passing legislation against it was to make sure that students don't think that the systems in America are inherently racist, because they're not. So no, you don't want students being taught that, especially when it essentially teaches them to hate their own country.
Julia, do you have anything to say to that in terms of that?
For sure. Well, firstly, I'd like to, once again, I don't know what this watered-down version of critical race theory being taught to people is that Grant is kind of describing, mainly because it is not taught K through 12. I don't think we are teaching kindergarteners critical race theory. But also, critical race theory doesn't inherently teach students to hate America or that America is a terrible place where you can't get ahead or you don't have equal opportunities. In fact, critical race theory is to teach the opposite. It's to teach people that you have to be aware of these systems and that these systems can change over time. I think to not teach critical race theory or to completely ban it is just a moral stand ground for Republicans to talk about race and say how they don't want race to be talked about in schools, mainly just because it wasn't taught K through 12 in the first place. If you want to say that, oh, talking about Martin Luther King or slavery is teaching about critical race theory, that's just teaching about American history.
That's just not true, though. Republicans aren't saying that we shouldn't be teaching about Dr. King or that we shouldn't be talking about slavery and the horrors of it. If you go to any American history course that is taught in Texas public high school, you're not going to find people completely avoiding these topics. They're very important to discuss, and they're still very important to talk about. So, pushing critical race theory into that sort of lane, it's just not true. What we're talking about is the idea that the systems in the United States are inherently racist. And yes, that can lead students to think that they should hate their own country. Because if you set things up where one is an oppressor and one is being oppressed on a regular level, and that the systems are created to set that up, you're going to get that framework and that mindset into the minds of students.
So adding on to that, how much do you think critical race theory or like these policies have influenced this election overall?
I think it was a topic and a focus mainly in the 2021 legislative session. I think it's something that, if you want to talk about where it really was important, it was important during, say, the elections in 2021 when Glenn Youngkin won his election and Republicans, for the first time in a generation, essentially swept in Virginia, which is almost unheard of today. So I don't think it's a main concern in Texas at this point because we addressed it in the 2021 legislative session. And I think that moving on, you're going to be looking at different types of issues in education that the House and the Senate are going to be addressing with a Republican legislator.
Speaking of other issues, we have immigration coming up next for our election special. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
We are continuing to update you with the latest election results tonight as the midterms continue around the country and polls continue to close. As we mentioned in our last segment, we have polls still waiting to close in the West, so we're continuing to keep an eye on those as hopefully we start to get results from some of those key races momentarily. Again, updating you on the governor's race once again. Greg Abbott continuing to extend his lead over Beto O'Rourke right now with 53.6% of the votes to Beto's 45.1%. 56% of the vote now in Texas. But again, that race has been called by many news outlets around the country. But again, we're continuing to keep an eye on that vote tally as well. We've talked a lot about education on the show in the last segment. So let's take a look at what's happening with the State Board of Education for District 5 here in Texas, since that is the district that includes Austin. Currently, the Republican there is leading with 72.3% of the vote, but there is only an estimated 9.9% of those votes counted, according to the Texas Tribune. So we're continuing to keep an eye on that race, as that will certainly be an important one as we continue to have these discussions about education. The Senate still watching a lot of close races there. We've got about 44% of the vote in now in Pennsylvania, another race we've been talking about a lot throughout the night. John Fetterman extending his lead since our last update. He is up over Dr. Oz by about 6% with 52% of the vote there. We've got 45% of the vote in Wisconsin, and continuing to see the trend we mentioned earlier with the Democrat there leading Ron Johnson, the current incumbent Republican senator in Wisconsin, by about 2%. Very close race there. It continues to stay extremely tight in Georgia like it has over the past few years. Herschel Walker now up by about less than half a point in Georgia, 72% of the vote in there, and he is up over Senator Warnock by about 12,000 votes. Still a contest in North Carolina. Ted Budd is up there, the Republican, by about 4 points. So it's continuing to be a busy night in politics. And will the House flip? It's getting close. Republicans have got 4 of the 5 pickups that they need. Will they get that 5th? And if they get that 5th, how much will they get over that? We're continuing to keep an eye on the balance of power in all the races here in Texas. Sending it over now to our panel.
Thank you once again, Logan. And this time we're going to be talking about immigration. And Joseph, I'm going to open with you first on this question. How important is border security in this election in terms of voter turnout?
Yeah, so definitely, border security is definitely like a big issue going into this election, Kevin. I mean, 66% of Texans said that immigration was an important issue going into this election. And we can see from the same poll that about 93% of Republicans believe that it was one of the key issues that was going to decide this election. And the same polls found that about 67% of Democrats said that it was going to be a deciding factor. And I mean, otherwise, looking at just what Abbott has done himself, he has said that the main issue concerning Texas security has been immigration. He wants to increase border security. He is trying to currently build a state border wall similar to the Trump border wall that was in the works a couple of years ago. And yeah, I mean, otherwise, Abbott just has remained consistent with his stance that border security is something that needs to be considered.
It's quite clear that border security has been something Abbott has been campaigning quite furiously on. Grant, can you go on and talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really just been that since the start of the Biden administration, we have seen a massive upsurge in illegal immigration, illegal border crossings. It's resulted in ICE being overworked and unable to completely handle the situation because they're not getting the support they need from the federal government. This has bled over into Texas DPS, where they're having to handle this situation in a fashion that has never been seen before. At this point, we've got more border crossings and more illegal immigrants in the United States. From those border crossings, I think the number at this point is roughly 2 million in the past year, it's just unheard of. So with all of that in mind, yes, Texans are tired of this situation. And I think one of the things that Governor Abbott has done that I would actually applaud is he's making these cities, the sanctuary cities, live up to their own statements and say, we're going to take care of these illegal migrants, and he's bringing them over to their cities. Because the cities in Texas that are getting the brunt of this, whether it's McAllen or Brownsville or Laredo, they're seeing the brunt of this and they're hurting because of it. And so Governor Abbott is actually making an effort to get illegal migrants out of those cities and bringing them to states where they're saying they want them. So let them see the results of their own policies.
Now, it's quite clear Beto has completely differing versions of his view on this. Julie, can you expand on that?
For sure. Beto has really championed doing bipartisan solutions. In fact, even criticizing the Democratic Party sometimes about how they have handled border security. What's interesting about his approach is that he's really trying to prioritize Americans, but especially people in the Texas National Guard. He wants to reunite families in the Texas National Guard, and he wants to help them with their families and careers, and thinks that their communities and what they do for us is one of the top priorities when we look at border control. He really also wants to look more into safe, legal, and orderly immigration systems. When we talk about illegal immigration, we have to look at the root problems. Why does illegal immigration exist? It's because sometimes it's really hard to get legal immigration, and you have to think why people would risk their lives crossing the border, risk their lives, maybe even ending up in detention camps because of crossing the border. When you look at reasons a lot of Mexican Americans might cross the border illegally or other migrants, it's usually because they are refugees. They are escaping really hard economic situations or are actually just trying to flee to safety. It is also a misconception that these border towns are really dangerous, with McAllen and El Paso being some of the safest cities in Texas and even sometimes in the nation.
Some of the points you pointed out there actually go on to my next question, and I'll have Ariba start on this one. But how could the balance of power affect the future of deferred action for childhood arrivals for the DAC-8 program? Ariba?
Yeah, so looking at DACA more broadly, we can see that there are currently over 101,000 Texas residents with DACA status. However, it does seem that the fate of DACA will likely rest in the hands of the court system, maybe not the legislature as much. Looking at our top two governor candidates, we see that Abbott does not support DACA, while Beto does.
And Joseph?
Yeah, just to add on to that a bit about what Abbott's policy is in terms of the DACA Act. He has in the past called for comprehensive immigration reform during the Trump administration, and more recently he has signed a directive which authorized the National Guard and the DPS to use force to return migrants to the border, or even in the case of them breaking the law or them simply crossing the border, Kevin.
And in terms of the next question itself, it also ties into this, like busing immigrants to New York City and whatnot. What are your thoughts on that, Ariba?
Yeah, looking again at the statistics more broadly, we see that a majority of Texas voters do support the busing of migrants, and majority of voters also feel that Abbott will do a better job securing the border than Beto. So in terms of border security, Beto is not doing so well in the minds of Texas voters.
And Julia, adding on to that, like, do you think that that's the right decision to do from Abbott's perspective, or like for what Beto's obviously been saying some quite different stuff at times? So that add on to that.
You know, from what I've seen of the situation, there's a lot of hearsay and things like that. But one of the main things that I find concerning is that they did not inform these migrants where they were going, and they were not led to believe that the places they end up at were the places they were supposed to end up at. You know, there's a lot of talk of this going all the way up to the Supreme Court, or Texas even being sued over this, because people are saying it is human trafficking to essentially bus loads of people and not tell them where they are going, or promise false promises to them and then take them to that location. In that sense, I do think it oversteps even the state of Texas into kind of a human rights issue.
Grant, can you tell me a little bit of what Abbott's thought process could have been in terms of busing these immigrants and if it's really justified?
Yeah, well, again, like what you said, it's hearsay. But what I do think is important is, again, these cities that he's been sending illegal migrants to, New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., all of them have openly said before, yes, we're happy to take in illegal immigrants. We are sanctuary cities, and we're going to protect these people. Okay, so make them protect these people. Make them take care of them. Provide them with the resources that you're saying Texans should be doing, because we can't do it. The cities on the border, no, they're not dangerous, and they're not as dangerous as people are making them out to be, but they're certainly hurting because their resources are not enough for 2 million border crossings a year. Some of these cities only have 40,000 people, and they've got over 15,000 crossing, or over 15,000 crossing over the course of a month. I mean, this is just not something that Texas cities, especially smaller Texas cities, can handle. So, yes, Governor Abbott's decision to bus these migrants to sanctuary cities, as they called them, it's a way for, one, Democrats to see the results of their own policies, and two, to relieve the pressure on Texas citizens.
So do you feel like how big of a deal does this resonate to voters out of all the different topics?
I don't see it as a major problem. I was even talking with a Democratic voter recently who said, yeah, I get a little chuckle out of the busing migrants policy that Abbott does. And so I think it's Texas voters reacting and saying, okay, somebody's doing something about it. I don't think it's a top priority because the economy and other issues are bigger issues than this to most voters. But I do think that, this is certainly something that maybe was in the back of voters' minds.
Thank you, Grant. And now we're going to toss it over back to Logan, who's going to bring you some updates regarding this midterm election.
Yeah, and we are continuing, Kevin, to keep a close eye on all of these results. Again, many more results coming in as we continue to move through the 9 o'clock hour here in Austin. Big Senate races, again, we're still watching them get tighter and tighter. Pennsylvania is the big one, of course, we're watching, where John Fetterman and Dr. Oz are continuing to face off. It's tight, but John Fetterman is up by about 5 points right now, and we've got just over half the vote in. But again, we know Pennsylvania may take a while, so we're continuing to keep an eye on that. And of course, Georgia, another place where we're keeping our eye, and some other races here across Texas. But again, the big headline of the night is that a lot of outlets are calling the governor's race for Governor Abbott, giving him his third term. Coming up in our next segment, we're going to have an exclusive interview with Senator Eckhart, who represents the Austin area in the state Senate here at the Capitol in Austin. But that wraps up our first part of our election coverage tonight. I'm Logan Duble. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope Vanderberg takes over our coverage right after the break. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be right back.
I'm Julia Mia at TSTV headquarters, and you're watching Texas News Primetime.
Welcome back to TSTV News Election Night in Texas. I'm Hope Vanderberg here at the election desk. Thank you for sticking with us for the second hour of our election broadcast. We will continue to keep you updated every 15 minutes or as news breaks with the latest numbers and key race alerts as the ballots are being counted. But first, let's take a look at TSTV News' exclusive interview with Senator Eckhart. I'm Rue Moody with Texas News Primetime here at the Capitol grounds, about to interview Senator Sarah Eckhart, who's running in the 2022 midterm elections.
Could you count to 10 for me real quick?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Are you good to go?
Do you mind going ahead and introducing yourself with a camera and
Sure.
what district you serve in?
Sure. Senate District 14. I'm Sarah Eckhart. I'm the state senator for most of Travis County.
And I would like to talk a little bit about your background, little context. Why did you decide to go into politics? I know you graduated from UT with law.
Mm-hmm.
Were you always intending to go into public service? Or?
No, my undergraduate is in theater. Okay. I was in theater for years, professional theater, actually. I ran a restaurant for a while. And then I decided to go to law school and to get a master's in public affairs when I was 30. I went back to school.
Okay, and how do you think your time at UT prepared you for the job that you do today?
Well, I came back to UT for that specific purpose. I wanted to go into law and policy work, and University of Texas was a great place for me to get a joint degree in law and public policy simultaneously. So I could come out in 4 years with 2 degrees.
Wow. And what was that mental change that made you want to go from theater to go back and get a law degree?
Well, I'm from a family that's very engaged in politics and policy. I sort of ran away from home, not wanting to do anything even remotely like what my parents had done, and really enjoyed my time doing theater, working with a great theater company that's still in existence, running my own business, which was really gratifying. But then around 30, I started to think, I spend a lot of time working on causes and campaigns and looking at policy, and I'd really like to go back to school and do that. And I didn't want to go into policy without having an academically rigorous background in it. It's great to have experience, but it's also really important to have the ability to find best practices.
Yes. What were the political issues that really struck you that made you want to pursue a career in it?
They are, unfortunately, the same issues that we're seeing today. Climate change, seeing that our rights were eroding, that we had hit possibly an apex of rights for women, for people of color, for our LGBTQIA community in the 80s, and now we were starting to move backwards. Also, I've always loved looking at large systems and figuring out how you can make a larger system work more effectively and efficiently. And I love my home state, but it doesn't necessarily work effectively and efficiently for the prosperity of all.
Yes. So flash forward to 2020, you're elected to serve as a senator in Texas, and now we're in 2022. What have you learned these past 2 years? What has that experience been like?
Well, I went in with eyes fully open. I knew what I was getting into. I was coming from county governance, which is, it's never perfect because government never is. But we work really hard at the local level to solve problems collectively. There's a great deal of agreement what the problem is. There's often very little agreement on how to address it, but at least everyone is committed and has a common understanding of what the problem is. But oftentimes when we were working on problems at the local level, the state simply would not share our view that a problem existed at all, and would often create problems for us. Just as we were solving one, they would figure out how to throw a monkey wrench into it. And so I decided it was time for me to try my hand at state policy. And so I'm glad to be here.
Well, majority of our viewers at Texas News Primetimes are students. So what would be your advice about student voting? Why is it important for students to vote?
Well, most of what we do here impacts the future. Most of what we do. And so you got a bunch of old people up here impacting your life in the future. So we need you to vote. We need you to make sure that you're holding our feet to the fire, that we're doing the right thing for your future. And also, we need you to vote and get in the habit of voting and your civic participation so that a good number of you decide to run.
Would you say that that is one of the benefits of students voting, is like dipping their feet into the pool of politics?
I don't want people just dipping their feet into the pool of politics. I want y'all swimming in it. I don't want just dipping toes in, and I need everyone all across the state of Texas, and most especially our students, to be swimming in not only politics but the policy. Politics is super exciting because it's very dramatic. It's about, you know, us versus them. Policy is about all of us. Much more nuanced, much more difficult, and you don't really have, or should not, have the luxury of telling yourself a story that makes you look good. ought to, in policy, be looking at all sides. So I would strongly encourage people to jump in the pool, get wet all the way up to, get in over your head, and be curious. Your sort of your entry drug into civic engagement is through politics, because it is so exciting. There's a bad guy and a good guy, and you're working for the good guy against the bad guy. But the further you get in, the more complex, and I think the more gratifying it becomes.
Okay, and lastly, going off of that idea of young people jumping into the pool of politics, what words of advice do you have for young women wanting to go into politics, especially in Texas?
Run. There's a wonderful Women's Campaign Academy over at the LBJ School. That's a great place to get a taste for what running looks like. It's also great to have like I said, to have an academic background as well as an experiential background that makes you able to hit the ground running. A lot of women feel intensely an imposter syndrome. Well, it shouldn't be me. There's somebody else who can do it. I'm really serving in a supportive role. We need to stop doing that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Senator Eckhart, and thank you for the past 2 years of public service.
Well, thank you for letting me do it.
For Texas News Primetime, I'm Rue Moody. Thank you, Senator Eckhart, for that interview. We are looking at the polls and seeing that the Texas Tribune has projected incumbent Senator Sarah Eckhart as the winner for the Texas State District 14 race. We have new faces on our panel continuing to bring you analysis on more topics being closely observed this election cycle right after this break. I'm Julia Mia at TSTV headquarters, and you're watching Texas News Primetime. Welcome back. All right, so we are looking at the races for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general currently, and we are seeing that Governor Greg Abbott is still leading the polls about 10%. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is also leading about 10% currently, and Ken Paxton leading for Attorney General about 10%. So now we are going to go back to Kevin to discuss balance of power and campus voting. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Hope. One of the biggest topics for this particular segment is talking about redistricting. And the first question I'm going to pose to Angie on your guys' left, how are redistricting in Texas picking up seats affecting the balance of power?
So Texas Republicans drew a new congressional map that favored incumbent Republicans and slightly decreased the number of competitive districts in the state. So Texas gained 2 congressional seats after the 2020 census after an increase in population. However, while non-Hispanic white people make up 40% of the Texas population and Hispanic people make up 39%, this is in contrast to the 42% of districts being white majority and Hispanics representing the majority in 26 districts only. White Texans represent a small percentage of that growth. The new map adds 3 districts where they are the majority.
Okay, and speaking on to my next question as well, how have Democrats campaigned to beat incumbents
So far, they focus on trying to win over voters through topics such as abortion and gun control, which have recently become stronger topics and issues for Texans.
And Michelle, I have the question for you. Is how are Republicans fortifying campaigns during the Great Migrations from California, New York, Chicago? Tell me a little bit about that.
So, we recently found that Greg Abbott said not long ago on a panel in August that Republicans are not concerned about the people coming in from California and other blue states. He said in that panel that a lot of those people coming here are conservative, so Republicans are not worried about people coming in from other states and turning the state blue. And
Grant, I would assume that you would agree with that part?
Yeah, it mostly it is that, but obviously, when you get to Austin, anybody who says, "Oh, I just moved here from California," we'll bet money that they're voting Democrat in the next election. But no, I think Governor Abbott has the right idea. I think his pitch to Californians and to New Yorkers and anybody moving to the state is, don't bring the policies that you left behind. So I think obviously that's something that he's been telling people for a number of years, and I think that people are resonating with that and listening to that.
And I would love to hear what Julie has to think in terms of redistricting, in terms of that. How does it affect the balance of power?
For sure, redistricting and gerrymandering, the more layman term for it, is always really controversial, especially with the last Texas special session, really focusing on voting rights. And in fact, a lot of Democrats flew all the way to Washington to protect voting rights and different voting laws. A lot of people are really concerned when you see polls and things of that such. For Democrats, a huge reason that they're voting and going out to the polls is that they're really focused on different balances of power and seeing what seeing who is in power and how they can get their voices more heard in a more fair state. When you look at things such as redistricting, I'm a geography major myself. I'm a huge nerd about this stuff. You can look at a lot of things such as cracking and packing. I know our district in itself, after the redistricting session, was a little bit cracked, where the east side was a little bit broken off of our district to lower the amount of Democrats in it. Luckily, Senator Eckhart still pulled through. But there's different strategies such as that are employed.
Great to hear, and have some water while you're at it. To my next question, I'm going to give it to Michelle on this one. How do you think the turn of tides for the Rio Grande Valley affect the future campaigns of races and how they will work in Texas?
So while the Rio Grande Valley has remained largely Democratic, Republican voters in the valley are increasing. Republican candidates in this area are campaigning on family, faith, and freedom, which greatly appeal to the majority of the Hispanics in that area, who are largely Catholic. Bill Clinton visited the area yesterday morning in support of Michelle Vallejo, who's running for an open seat in the Rio Grande Valley. The Republican contenders are all women and ridiculed Clinton for that visit. Mayra Flores is the 34th district representative, who is the first female Mexican-born member in the House and campaigned on God, family, and country.
And Grant, I would assume you will have a lot to add on to the...
Yeah, I think the three candidates down there, Cassie Garcia, Monica de la Cruz, and Mayra Flores, have all done spectacular jobs. Obviously, those districts were, when they were drawn to definitely favor Democrats. So if they lose their elections tonight, that makes some sense. But what I saw when I went down there a couple weeks ago is I saw some momentum, I saw passion, and I saw enthusiasm in a community that really is just inspired to get out there, get the vote out, and make sure that those who are representing them represent their values. And I think that's going to be a spark that you see ignited across not just Texas, but across the country as well.
Speaking across Texas in just terms of voting, one of the biggest influences of this election, you would say, is college campus voting. Only 50% of colleges, however, have actual campus voting. I'm going to pose the question first to Angie. How do you think this impacts Texas colleges overall, public colleges?
So only 50% of Texas colleges and 20% of historically black colleges and universities had early voting places. However, this number changed with 55% of public colleges on election day, and also increased for historically black colleges as well. But this is also leading to another problem, where Texas is one of the last states to not accept student IDs for voting. Beto, on the other hand, hand, supports online and same-day registration, expanding forms of ID to accepted to vote, and expanding access of polling places. So he wants to expand more on voting to make it more accessible, as largely not seen more in the Republican parties.
And Michelle, like, I know Abbott hasn't necessarily come to college campuses as much as Beto, but what do you think the impact for college campus voting has on the Republican side?
Well, we see that 9 out of 12 universities with large student populations in Texas have early voting locations this year. Meanwhile, the smaller schools only have 3 early voting locations. Texas A&M is one of the biggest schools in Texas, but some early voting locations have been removed. The county has helped the school by allocating funds to help people take buses to voting locations, which includes the bus shuttles in the area.
Now, UT Austin has a lot of voting locations, so it's Hookum, great to be on here at UT Austin. For my next question, I got to ask you guys, the PCL was actually, the Petty Castaneda Library was actually one of the biggest places to vote, and it actually changed its voting location because it did not fit some ADA requirements. So how big of an impact was that on the voting behavior for us college students here on campus? Julie, I'm going to start with you.
For sure. I've just seen from personal accounts how long the lines were this year at the FAC. It was really insane to see, but also makes me really hopeful that there's so many young people ready to vote. At the end of the day, I think voting is for everyone, and a lot of students face different barriers of entry to vote, such as maybe not always having an ID on them, but also trying to fit in voting between class times. So I think it's really important to have those on-campus voting areas.
The lines were really long throughout the entire day. When I was walking here to the set, it was, well, an interesting sight for sure. Crane, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Obviously, early voting, that's something I did. I assume most of us in here probably did some form of early voting or voted today. But I do think that, you know, the FAC, the lines there, if you went to early vote, sometimes they fluctuated from good to bad to really just nobody was there. You know, the whole thing about IDs, obviously we need identification in order to vote. I think that's a pretty easy thing to understand, and most students carry around a wallet or a purse that allows them to have their ID on them at all times, or you just put it in your bag. So yeah, there are very easy ways to remedy that, and I think, you know, the FAC, the fact that people are going out and they're voting, that's fantastic.
And Michelle, do you have any statistics to talk about the PCL's replacement in terms of the LBJ school was actually like the new location? Do you have anything to talk about that?
Yeah, so a little more about that. The Travis County Commissioner's Court found that the PCL did not meet the Americans with Disability requirements. So polling was moved to LBJ, which is located farther east campus. A lot of students on campus are first-time voters, and a lot of them found it difficult to get to LBJ since it's in a completely different area of campus, and are overwhelming the Flan Academic Center, creating long waits of voting in one of the only centers in our campus.
So I'm going to pose this to my entire panel here. How big of an impact was that PCL's replacement with the LBJ school as a new voting location? We'll start from Julia.
For sure. When we talk about voter apathy, I do think long lines maybe sometimes affect that. But at the end of the day, we still did have a central voting location here on campus, so I think we did pretty good with that, along with LBJ is still walkable for most students. I think it's really interesting to see most people think that barriers to entry to vote, or that making it harder to vote and less accessible would actually hurt people or would actually get more blue votes. But in many states, when you see that it's easier to vote, you see an increase in votes leaning red. So I think it's really interesting. Once again, I support anyone being able to vote. That is like one of the main things Beto also ran on, was making it easier to register to vote and to do same-day registration and things of that such. So yeah, that's my opinion on the PCL not being there. I think it's amazing that they're following ADA guidelines. I wouldn't be against that.
Hopefully next time we have this, PCL will be ADA compliant with all different things. But coming up after the break, we'll be talking a lot about different policies in Texas, so stay tuned.
Welcome back. As the panel took a look at the balance of power, we are going to take a look at the polls tonight. So in the U.S. House Texas delegation, as discussed, there are 2 new House seats up for grabs in Texas. We have 12 seats still up for grabs with a predicted 17 Republicans, with 4 being uncontested and 9 Democrats with no uncontested candidates. In the Texas House, there are 76 seats still up for grabs, seeing 42 Republicans with 36 uncontested and 32 Democrats with 22 uncontested. In the Texas Senate, we are seeing 19 seats still up for grabs, with 8 Republicans, 7 of which are uncontested, and 4 Democrats with 3 uncontested candidates. To look a bit into our Austin area local candidates, the U.S. House District 37, the Texas Tribune is predicting Lloyd Doggett to take that win. And as earlier discussed, Texas Senate District 14, Sarah Eckhart is the projected winner. And in Texas House District 49, Gina Hinojosa is the projected winner, according to Texas Tribune. Looking back at some of our key races from tonight, we are seeing Governor Abbott currently leading by about 11% to his competitor Beto, with 60% of the votes currently in. And we are seeing a little bit of a jump from our Lieutenant Governor candidate, Dan Patrick. He is currently leading now about 13%. And in the Attorney General's race, also seeing a bit of a jump there. Ken Paxton is leading by a small, a bit of a more margin there with about 12%. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Hope. One of the biggest campaigning factors this election cycle has been on the topic of LGBTQ plus policies. So I'm going to start off with Michelle. How has Abbott/Paxton's investigation of LGBTQ families affected Texans' views of the incumbent?
So for Republicans, Abbott's LGBTQ policies remain a big part of their platform and align with their goals and ideals. On the other hand, Politico released a report about the projection of LGBTQ voters in the coming years. They find that by 2030, 1 out of 7 voters will identify as LGBTQ, and 1 out of 5 by 2040. For now, it aligns with Republicans' values. However, the data points to this possibly changing in the future, as LGBTQ voters usually identify as Democratic.
And Grant, can you expand on that? And Julie, let's wait for Grant to finish his statements on this.
What do you mean?
Anyway.
Well, I think she's put it pretty clear. You know, Texas Republicans, the values that they have are pretty clear, and they're set out by Governor Greg Abbott. I think that's really all there is to say about it right now.
And Julia?
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, how has Abbott/Paxton's investigation of LGBTQ families affected Texans' views on the incumbents?
For sure. So the criminal investigations of parents who want to provide their children gender-affirming care has been up for a lot of talk lately, especially with the Travis County judge stating that he doesn't agree with that and states that families cannot be investigated if those members are part of the advocacy group FLAG. I think this is really interesting and will expand so much farther than Texas, with people saying this might even go up to higher courts.
Okay. And then for our next topic is that we also wanted to talk about how Abbott wants to prioritize passing a Don't Say Gay bill, as critics have dubbed it similar to one recently passed in Florida. Now, how has this also shifted the likelihood of power? How does this shift the power affecting the likelihood of this passing? And I'm going to open up to Angie on this one.
So Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has expressed interest in passing a bill similar to the Don't Say Gay Florida bill, citing it as a top priority for next year's legislative session. The bill prohibits classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity. And this can also be pointed the consequences to a Florida middle school teacher who was fired for discussing her sexuality with her students. So there were already consequences being seen about this, and not necessarily in the graphic way that some people might think the Don't Say Gay bill prohibits. As well as this comes at a time when classrooms in the state are dealing with a significant teacher shortage. And O'Rourke's plan policy involves overturning Trump's ban on transgender people serving in the military, reversing the deploy or get out policy, bringing back the U.S. Education Department guidance that sought to protect LGBTQ plus people, students, and crack down on student therapy, on conversion therapy, update blood donation requirements for LGBTQ people, increase the representation in the census, and install more pro-LGBTQ plus people in government.
Julie would like to expand on that as well.
Sure. I think it's going to be something really hard for teachers to deal with. At the end of the day, we still have to think about the impacts that COVID-19 had on teachers and teacher retention rates. Adding things like this that could criminalize teachers is unfortunately really bad for them, and it can also cause more tension within this teaching scene. When it comes to a lot of education policy and things like that, we do tend to copycat Florida. Our critical race theory bill was a copycat of Florida's bill almost exactly, so I do intend to see this in the upcoming session. Something that is upsetting for a lot of constituents is that they want other policies such as energy or fixing the grid to be on for the next session, and they think that things like this is just a way for Abbott and lieutenant governors to say how much they don't support the LGBTQ plus community.
And Mr. Rommel, I forgot your first name for a second.
It's Grant.
But it's Grant. Okay. In terms of what Abbott's done in terms of prioritizing the Don't Say Gay bill, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think first of all, the bill itself is called the Parental Rights in Education bill. So let's quit with the media moniker that it's just a Don't Say Gay bill. It is a bill that prohibits the discussion of sexual orientation. That's not just the LGBTQ community, that is for straight people as well. So you can't talk about your sexual orientation to students. A middle school teacher doesn't need to be talking about their sexual orientation and their personal lives inside the classroom. That's their personal life. Their professional life is with the students. So to keep that in mind, yes, we can focus on this in the next upcoming session. Thousands of bills are filed at the start of every session, and we can multitask and get energy done. We can get border policy done. We can get immigration done, and economic things that we need to get done too. So no, I completely reject the idea that this is just something that the governor and the lieutenant governor are wanting to grandstand about. This is a policy measure that parents are going to start having concerns about, and the fact that we're seeing more sexualization in schools today when it comes to certain books and certain pieces of literature. Yeah, parents are concerned about that, and this is one of the ways that we can address it.
Thank you so much, Grant. I do remember your name this time. Not to forget it again. Coming back after the commercial break, we'll be talking about crisis management. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. We just had a national key race alert come in. We have several news organizations, including NBC, calling Josh Shapiro the winner for Pennsylvania governor. Following some of those other tight races nationally, we are seeing the U.S. Senate race in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman beating out candidate Dr. Oz by a mere 2%. And then looking into the U.S. Senate race in Georgia, we have Herschel Walker leading Raphael Warnock by only 0.2%. So we will continue to keep you updated on those polls tonight. In the governor's race in Texas, we just had the New York Times call the race for Abbott as the winner with 63% of the votes in. In the Texas lieutenant governor's election, we are seeing Dan Patrick continuing to lead with 52% of the votes in. He is currently leading about 13%. And in the Texas Attorney General race, Ken Paxton is currently leading 12% with 52 of the votes in. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Hope. Remember the pandemic, guys? It seems like so long ago, but
I remember the winter storm.
Well, we're going to talk about the winter storm. We're going to talk about the winter storm, but before we get into that, let's talk about the pandemic response. How do you think that actually affected voter habits and the turnout? And I'm going to start off with Michelle on this one.
So during the COVID-19 surges, specifically in 2021, Greg Abbott focused on blocking local mandates and protecting the rights of the unvaccinated. For Republican voters, this reinforced their support for Abbott.
And Angie?
So in February 2022, a poll cited COVID as being one of the biggest issues facing Texas. However, since then, has fallen behind border security, inflation, abortion, and the economy. Texans will likely base their votes on these issues rather than the result of the pandemic response.
And Julie would like to expand on that.
For sure. For Democrats, it seems a huge voting bloc of them are really concerned about COVID, but especially about vaccination rates and their children going back to school without being vaccinated, with kids that could be unvaccinated.
What about you, Grant?
Yeah, so I think, Republicans, we're not worried about the pandemic anymore. I think most people have had it at this point. I've had it probably twice at this point. I'm willing to bet all of you have had it at least once. So with that in mind, I think, Republicans were saying, look, obviously we need to protect the elderly and the young who could be more vulnerable to this than anybody else. But at this point, I think, the pandemic phase of this is probably over. And I think that with that in mind, Texas voters are moving on from it.
And the pandemic had that, well, we teased it a little bit, the actual winter storm, winter apocalypse, whatever you want to dub it. I wasn't here on campus when it happened, so thank goodness to myself. But I'm not mistaken, Grant, you were actually on campus?
No, so I was back home, but my roommate was actually in our apartment at the time. We had pipes burst, we had flooding. We got to, I want to say, 100,000 something views on TikTok because of it, because somebody decided they were going to video all of it. But it was quite crazy when I got back. The only thing I asked my roommate to do was to make sure none of my stuff was supremely damaged. He did that, and I'd like to thank him for it. But no, it was maddening to see. Fortunately, I wasn't there for it, and I wasn't affected in the way that the rest of Texas was, with the electric and water grids being hurt, obviously. But I will say, I think the impact of that was, a lot of angry constituents across the state. When I was interning in the Texas House at the time, week I got back, it was phone calls, and emails, all about Winter Storm Uri. And people obviously were upset, and I think that was properly addressed in the legislative session after.
And I want to talk to Angie about this. How do you think, expanding from what Grant said, how do you think that also affected the race overall?
Well, to start off with, the ERCOT, Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is a nonprofit that operates the Texas grid. However, it is overseen by the Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Texas State Legislature. The head of the PUC was appointed to that role by Abbott in 2017. And with what voters think is that 60% of them disapprove of how state leaders handle the power grid's reliability, while only 18% approved. Among independent voters, 61% disapproved of the state work on the grid, along with 45% of Republicans and 43% of rural voters who were dissatisfied with the state's work on the issue.
Thank you so much, Angie. And Julia, if I'm not mistaken, you were the one who was on campus when this whole issue.
I unfortunately was on campus. I was really shocked to see a reaction when I was telling you about how people in Wampus were fighting over snow to put in our toilets to flush them. It seemed like an apocalypse, almost like the purge. Almost every single grocery store was completely wiped out. But I keep thinking about the privilege I had to even have that experience, because a lot of people were really affected. A lot of those people that actually needed medical attention or help during that time were really affected by that. A huge reason for this is because of the privatization of ERCOT. A lot of people are against that, and when summer heat is coming around just the corner, or another winter is coming around, people and constituents are more and more concerned about this issue because they don't want to have to go through that again. Many Texas families suffered greatly from this, and it's also very suspicious, and a lot of Greg Abbott's policies and things like that have come under scrutiny because of how a lot of people that gained money from this power outage have been the ones funding his campaign.
Thank you so much, Julie. We're going to interrupt this. We're going to have a key race update. We're going to send it over to Hope. Hope?
Thank you, Kevin. Is that Greg Abbott has been officially called as the winner for Texas governor. He is leading the polls with 55.3% of the votes, with 63 of the votes in, and has been officially called the winner. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Hope. And we really have talked a lot about the winter storm. Well, when we come back after this commercial break, we'll be concluding our election special with a lot of different stuff. So back to commercial. See you guys in a bit.
Welcome back. We have another key race alert. The Austin City Council District 9 is going into a runoff for the 2022 midterm elections. Since we have seen that Governor Greg Abbott has been called as the winner, we're going to take another look into the Lieutenant Governor and Attorney General races. We are seeing that Dan Patrick is still leading with 54% of the votes in, with 55.3% of the votes, still leading about 13%. And for Attorney General, Ken Paxton, with 54% of the votes in, is leading the polls 55.1% of the votes, and is leading about 13% as well. Back to you, Kevin.
It's been a fun one. Wouldn't you say that?
Perhaps.
Yes.
Perhaps.
I
Okay.
had fun.
All right. So my final question.
Voters have really put in their work. I loved seeing all the vibrancy on campus, how many people were staying out and staking out to vote. I thought this race was a lot closer than what most people are used to, so I hope this keeps motivating people to go out to the polls and vote blue.
What about you, Angie?
I am, a part of me is not necessarily surprised as how historically Texas has voted. It does feel a bit weird after seeing, like how Julie mentioned, many students going out into the polls and trying to vote and really trying to encourage other people to vote. So this, it really could have gone both ways, and it has been called as Greg Abbott winning.
And Michelle, what are your thoughts?
I think it was really interesting to see how a lot of the big cities in Texas, like Dallas, Houston, Austin, or the border towns or El Paso, have thousands of blue votes, and then the rest of Texas, they have much less votes, but they somehow still won, which I think is very, very interesting.
And Grant?
Yeah, so I think Texas is just being Texas. It's a continuation of dominant Republican policies and dominant Republican candidates. I think the better candidates won tonight. Whether it be the governor's race or whether it be congressional races. But I think we're going to have an interesting legislative session coming up in 2023. You know, I'm going to be keeping my eye on the Senate races for tonight in the House, in the U.S. Congress. Should have some close races there. But I think it'll set up not just for some interesting stuff in the near future in 2022 and 23, but also the presidential races race and the primaries coming up in 24.
And you already kind of touched on this and what you basically just said, but what do you think the impact of this going on from the future will have towards Texas or just the nation in general?
I think Texas is going to stay red. I know that for the past few years we've been talking about, oh, Texas, it's purple now. It's purple now. If we run the right candidate, we're going to win it. No. Texas is red, it's staying red, and it's going to continue to be that. Texans showed that. I mean, Greg Abbott's leading by, 12 points tonight? And Beto O'Rourke is that spark candidate that people have been talking about since 2018. It's just, Texas is not going anywhere. It's staying exactly where it is, and I think the idea that Texas is going blue anytime soon, it's just a pipe dream.
And Julia, what do you think the future has in stake for Texas?
You know, with minority populations booming in Texas who usually lean blue, and as you see these like city strongholds of blue places really holding through each election, I think I have to disagree with Grant. I think Texas could be purple in the future, and it's really interesting to see how the tides slowly turn back and forth. As always, Texas is an amazing state. It's such an amazing state because it dictates so much for national policy as well. So I'm really excited to see how future administrations federally will really affect Texas runoffs as well.
So we can only see how it turns out in the future. Thank you so much for everybody coming on to my panel. It's a little round of applause, honestly, right here. Yeah, let's go, guys. Anyways, for tonight, thank you for joining us tonight. You can follow us on TSTV News, Good Morning Longhorns, and Texas News Primetime on social media by just searching. Also, take us on the go by just subscribing to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. From all of us at TSTV News, thank you for joining us in this election night in Texas. And now, go out and change your world. Good night.